The Rebellers by Jane Roberts, a novel, published 1963, read by Martin John. Chapter 7. The door opened noiselessly, widened, and then held where it was. Fitch stood behind it by the wash basin, ready to defend himself if necessary. He heard a step, then another. Sloat's head appeared. It turned slightly. Fitch saw the chinless face looking with surprise at the empty bed. Grinning, he said, "Looking for somebody, Sloat?" And Sloat swung around. "I came in to see if you were up yet." "Awfully quiet about it, weren't you?" Fitch said. He thought that Sloat gave him a quick, scrutinizing glance, but he couldn't be sure because the other man hid his feelings so well. If Sloat was his ally, he wasn't letting on. He looked as if he hadn't slept all night. Fitch thought of mentioning the fact, but decided against it. "Toby is waiting to see you," Sloat said quietly. "In this?" Fitch said. He laughed, pointing to the woolen robe that hung from his shoulders to the floor. "I have one on. There's standard garb around here." Fitch shrugged. Sloat said, "You'll find that your meeting with Toby will be a most memorable occasion. He's a very unusual man." He spoke in his usual dry manner, but again Fitch felt as if Sloat wanted to say more but changed his mind. Instead, Sloat merely smiled, and they went out the door. Out in the hall, Sloat said, "You'll have a checkup first, and some shots. So many diseases are going around that half of them don't even have names yet. And we can't take any chances. Incidentally, your room was as sanitary as we could manage. Even the sheets on your bed were treated with special disinfectants that were soaked up by your pores as you slept." "Good idea," Fitch said. His body hadn't touched the sheets. He looked sideways at Sloat to see exactly how much Sloat knew, but Sloat's face was impassive. "Toby wanted you to know that we'd taken steps to ensure your health," Sloat said, and this time there was a definite hint of irony in his voice. "I appreciate it," Fitch said, and grinned. They paused in front of one of the many doors that lined the corridor. "The doctor is in here. I'll wait for you," Sloat said. He pushed the door partially open. Fitch shoved it open all the way and looked around the room before entering. It had no windows. A chair, a desk, and some cabinets were the only furniture. A doctor stood with his back turned. Even without seeing the man's face, Fitch recognized him. It was the same doctor who had treated him earlier. Alarm prickled along his spine. But he allowed no surprise or dismay to show on his face. For one thing, he was more confident than he had been earlier. For another, there were no, quote, attendants, end quote, this time. He and the doctor were alone. Without turning, the doctor said, "Name?" "Fitch. Gary Fitch." "Ah, yes," the doctor said. He wrote the name down in a record book. Then he looked over to Fitch. Their eyes met. The doctor showed no signs of recognition, and Fitch said nothing. Nevertheless, he was certain that the doctor remembered their last encounter. "Now, young man, for some antibiotic shots," he said. Though his voice was even, it carried tones of vague unease. Fitch wanted to laugh. Now the tide had turned. The doctor was afraid that he'd fight as he had earlier, and that he'd refuse the shots. And Fitch was a much bigger man than he was. Nevertheless, though he felt safe enough, Fitch knew he was taking a chance, but he was certain that nothing would happen to him until he'd seen Toby. And he needed whatever medical protections the rebellers could give. All professional smiles now that Fitch was so compliant. The doctor also gave him a quick examination. The whole thing was over in 15 minutes. At the door, Fitch said, "What, no undertakers?" and had the satisfaction of seeing the doctor's eyes flash with something like fear. Out in the hall, Sloat was still waiting. "You don't trust me very much, Fitch, do you?" he said. "Should I? Listen, I haven't any reason to trust anyone. I know you've seen that doctor before." The usual stoicism of Sloat's chinless features gave way to a half-smile. Doctors, the medical colleges, such as they are, give diplomas that don't mean anything for a fat fee, Sloat went on. No wonder the people are so afraid of the medical profession. This man is really good, though, and he keeps his mouth shut as long as we pay him well. Is he a rebeller? Who knows, Sloat said, and smiled. Fitch paused to look around the corridor. It was damp and poorly lit. For the first time, the woolen robe he wore made sense. It was warm. "Where do you keep all your men, by the way? They certainly aren't in evidence." "I'm to take you on a tour when your interview with Toby is over," Sloat said. "You'll see the layout." As he spoke, Sloat turned swiftly, pressing with his back against the rocky wall. A portion slid open, giving access to a small hidden vestibule. They went inside. As they did so, the black wall of the room slid away, letting them into a large study. Toby will be here in a few minutes, Sloat said. Good luck. He turned and went out. Fitch made no move to stop him. The walls slid closed. The room contained a huge desk. Carpeting covered the floor. The place seemed deserted, but Fitch felt that he was being observed. Full-length mirrors lined the walls. There was a chair in front of the desk. He sat down calmly, hiding his impatience. The door through which he'd entered was the only one he could see in the room. The wall slid back and it opened. He turned slightly to get a good look at the man who entered. He'd always been methodological in studying details. Now he gave the leader of the rebellers a quick but complete visual examination, but without giving any indication of doing so. Would the man be an enemy or a friend, or perhaps both? Toby walked swiftly across the room. He was almost as tall as Sloat, but stockier, with jet-black hair and small, glinting eyes. He moved with amazing energy, came forward and smiled so infectiously that Fitch found himself grinning back. "I'm Toby. At last we meet," he said. "So it seems." Toby sat down at the desk. Fitch sat where he was, resisting the natural inclination to move his own chair closer. He was shorter than Toby, but more compact. Toby arranged his own woolen robe around him. Watching him, Fitch knew he had at least one advantage over the other man. He didn't give a damn about appearances, but Toby obviously did. With a flash of intuition, he knew more. He was capable of a great self-reliance if the need arose. But Toby's mobile features showed a certain dependence upon props. The mirrors and the huge desk, for example. Fitch thought of all these things quickly, and he remained cautious. He sensed some of Toby's weaknesses, but he still had to learn where the power lay. He already had some idea. Toby's friendly manner was more contagious than he wanted to admit. He knew he liked the man, though they'd hardly spoken yet. "You're holding back on me," Toby said with a smile. The remark was obviously meant to take Fitch back. "Am I?" "Something's on your mind. You're fighting me, and I've hardly opened my mouth." "You expect instant loyalty without any basis for trust?" "We saved your life." Toby's expressive face smiled ruefully. "Perhaps nowadays an explanation is even expected for that." "It seems so," Fitch said. He didn't say so, but Toby's voice was oddly familiar. Fitch kept trying to place it as Toby spoke, but he failed. He said, "I'd like to know more about the rebellers, for one thing. I'd like to know what I'm doing here, to get to the point." Toby shrugged with quick self-depreciation. "I'm at a loss dealing with an artist. I haven't known any before. Ask me any questions you want, though. I assure you that my intentions are of the best." Fitch made up his mind suddenly to give Toby the benefit of a doubt. But he wouldn't go any further than that. "All right," he said. "There's an explanation due, and I'm interested to hear what you have to say about it. For instance, what about the pillows wired for sound and indoctrination carried on while a man is sleeping? That doesn't sound like good intentions to me," he said angrily. "There's something menacing in all this. I dislike pretense. I don't like games." A broad smile spread over Toby's compelling features. He laughed outright. "I should have known you wouldn't fall for that. But then it wasn't intended for a man of your caliber." "Never mind the flattery," Finch said. "I'm not going to be used. I'll tell you that. My knowledge of the outside might be limited, but I'm learning fast, and I'm nobody's fool." "Did someone warn you about the bed? How did you discover it?" Fitch decided that honesty had gone far enough. "No one warned me," he said. "It didn't take a suspicious man too long to feel the wires in that pillow." "All right. I don't blame you." Toby dropped the smile. He said earnestly, "The rebellers are the hope of mankind, if mankind has any hope at all. My little trick is only my way of dissolving prejudices that might blind an outsider before he'd even heard our side." Toby paused and went on. "As you know, the northeast section of the Contrapolis is divided into 20 subdivisions or boroughs. Well, the local Elmira borough used us as a convenient scapegoat. When there's a food shortage, due to their own poor planning, then the rebellers have stolen from the chemical gardens, or we've sabotaged them, or some such. So now and then I use their methods to protect us. If one of their officials gets in here by mistake, the indoctrination prevents him from taking action until we find him out." Toby's eyes darkened. "I don't like to use those tactics, but they're justified." "We'll let that go for the present," Fitch said. "Now what about the rebellers?" "You're persistent, I'll say that," Toby said. "We have about 400 men here, a small number considering. However, our percentage of scientists and doctors is high. Conditions outside are hardly conducive to their kinds of work. And we attract them. Without them, we could hardly exist. Okay, what's the purpose of the group? Toby spread his hands, smiling. You want to know it all now. Now. All right. Our purpose is implicit in our name. We're rebelling against life as it is for the masses of people. We believe that man can be a creature of dignity, integrity, and creativity. Filth, starvation, crowded quarters lead to man's degradation as a biological species, and indeed will result in his extinction. Toby's voice rose, expanded. Fitch could no longer doubt Toby's convictions. It was impossible, listening to him, not to realize that the man meant every word he said. Toby stood up, pacing the room. Man is a part of nature, not apart from it. He must live according to nature's laws or vanish. Any species that overbreeds consumes its environment and is in turn consumed. Quantity leads to a loss in quality. Toby stared at Fitch defiantly. Okay, go on. At one time, the race depended upon quantity for survival, Toby said. Now it's destroying itself. We believe that man's unique characteristics, imagination, psychic understanding, sympathy, and so forth, are being undermined. Even if the race survives physically, it won't be the same race. We won't be bright enough to recognize our fall from grace either. That's the hell of it. Tests show that though our mental capacity is as great as ever, our use of it has slumped to an astonishing degree. Granted, that's all true, Fitch said. What about the national government? Can't it do anything at all? The government, Toby said disdainfully. What is it? A shell remains. The rest is gone. Instead of doing anything constructive, it uses its dying energies to preserve the status quo. The framework is there, but it hangs suspended like a dead spider. Touch it, and it crumbles. Elections are still held, but no one votes. The people are too damned busy just trying to stay alive. The officials elect themselves back in the office. He lowered his voice. I can tell you one thing. Because of diet deficiencies and the horror of daily life, 7 out of 10 people are psychopaths. This includes those in government. There isn't any place to turn. He stopped speaking. His face was white and drawn. Then how do you justify the relative luxury of this place? Fitch said quietly. You still don't understand, do you? Toby said. In order to be effective, the rebellers must be strong. We have decent diets. We create conditions under which we can function to the best of our capacities. We must have solitude, for example. Without these conditions, we'd be as poorly equipped as the masses to deal with the problem. When the time comes to act, we have to be ready. In the meantime, what are you doing to solve the problem? How are you helping? For a moment, Toby was silent. He continued to pace the room. His face, stern and impassive now, was reflected in the many mirrors. The effect of Toby's manner and mood was powerful. Fitch grinned to himself. Granted, Toby meant what he said. He was also very conscious of the value of every move he made. Fitch said again, quietly, "I asked you, how does all this help?" "We exist," Toby said. "You exist? That's all? How does that help anything? You exist?" "We exist as whole men, as human beings with self-respect and integrity," Toby said. "We exist as a pool from which the race can continue to expand its energies and grow. We exist as a contrast to men as they are today. We exist as a hope and a promise." Fitch just stared at him. "You don't know how important that is," Toby said. "Listen, even our origins are lost. For 3 generations, men have been living underground here, right here. How many might be doing the same thing, if any, in other places? Who knows? Our ignorance about the past is appalling. That's why we need men like you who have some knowledge of the past. Those galleries have been closed to the public for centuries. The government has no right to withhold knowledge from the people." "And would you give it to them?" Fitch said. For the first time he caught Toby off guard. Toby said, "I'd keep it until the people could use and understand it. In the meantime, the rebellers would use it to enlarge our capabilities." He broke off and continued in a hush whisper, "I tell you, without it our hands are tied." It was Fitch's turn to pause. He said slowly, "Suppose you discovered that though your aims were good, your methods were wrong." Toby stared at him. He said without hesitation, "Then we'd change our methods." "I might remind you of that some day," Fitch said. The interview was over. "There'll be a general meeting tonight," Toby said. "I'm afraid we have another plague problem. Sloat will take you on a tour of this place now." "Aren't you taking a chance? How do you know I won't try to escape?" Toby stood in front of Fitch, almost gangly now in his robe. At the desk he'd given the impression of power. Now even his frame seemed to shrink. He shook Fitch's hand with an oddly vulnerable, almost defenseless gesture and smiled. "We take some chances," he said, "but not too many." The wall slid aside for Fitch. He went out. No one was in sight in the hall, and Fitch found himself trying to remember again where he'd heard Toby's voice before. Other things bothered him. How much of the man was genuine, and how much was calculated acting? A man so contradictory was someone to watch out for. He didn't know if he trusted the leader of the rebels or not, but he liked him. Suddenly, as Fitch stood in the hall, a shaft of cold air hit his legs as if a door had opened. The next moment the lights went out. Sounds of a scuffle arose. A defiant voice yelled, "Fitch!" It was Mandy Braille, Fitch's roommate at the gallery. Fitch was sure. He plunged down the hall toward the voice. Then the lights came back on. The hallway was empty. Fitch paused. Then Mandy yelled out again, only this time from a different direction. "Mandy!" Fitch shouted. He felt another shaft of cold air. "Mandy!" he yelled again. Desperately, he began feeling the wall with his hands, looking for some sort of opening. End chapter 7. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.